On today's episode, I'm excited to have Matt Surf from Ava's Wild. Ava's Wild is a fisherman-run distributor delivering premium wild sockeye salmon from the world's most sustainably managed wild salmon fishery in Bristol Bay, Alaska. They were founded and operate on a simple premise: eat wild, save wild. It's literally in their name. Ava's is save spelled backwards. We talked about the industry as a whole, farm salmon versus wild salmon, sustainability, and what the future looks like for the industry. Hope you enjoy. How would you describe Ava's Wild in your own terms?
We are a really small team. It's myself. I'm a Bristol Bay commercial salmon fisherman. Been fishing up there about 10 years. I run a boat in the fishery. My partner is Mark Titus. He's someone with a lot of experience in the fishery as a fisherman from back in the 80s, working on processors, but also in the last couple decades as a filmmaker. He's made 2 feature-length award-winning documentaries about Bristol Bay, about salmon habitat, and we are both kind of united around a obsession sort of with high-quality salmon and the ability for high-quality, sustainably managed salmon as a food product to be a core tool in protecting and restoring wild salmon habitat and creating that sort of circular link that brings the story of the place to the plate and then brings the plate and the marketing of the fish back to the origin, which I think right now is missing in both ways. A lot of the salmon that's marketed and sold from our fishery, and it's a huge fishery. We put up a couple thousand small family-run boats together. We harvest about 40 million sockeye a year
Wow.
on a big year, and that's 300 million pounds of fish, like a lot of fish. Right now, a lot of it is kind of sold as a commodity. It's sold trying to compete with things like farm salmon. The story's not really being told well about the quality and the sustainability of the product. And then we also feel like a lot of people in the distribution space don't really have skin in the game in terms of connection with the region, with the indigenous-led efforts to protect the region, and with a lot of the really high stakes and high action campaigns to push back against things like a proposal to build the largest open pit copper mine in the world, which is very active right now in Bristol Bay, and other kind of threats to really the last stronghold for wild salmon in the world. And so it's not a succinct answer, but that's kind of where we see ourselves.
So what's the difference between a farm salmon and something wild like what you guys are producing? So quote unquote producing, harvesting. Is there a taste difference? Is there, and maybe a little bit about the farming itself. Is it sustainable? Is it pretty nasty stuff?
To be honest, it changes year to year, and I'm not someone who will just blanket bash farm aquaculture. I think there's a place for it in our world. I think that a lot of wild salmon and wild fish stocks in general are really overfished. And in that context, there's a lot of really good, responsible aquaculture that's done. I think farmed salmon it's pretty easy to make a boogeyman out of because it can be done in a way that's horrendous for the environment, especially when done in sea. There's a lot of terrestrial aquaculture that's done in really interesting ways that, blends fish, shellfish, and things like seaweed production that can be really cool and inspiring. But yeah, unfortunately, a lot of the farm salmon industry, massive net pens that are a huge polluter in whatever environment they're put in. There's been huge escapement events where fish that are raised on a lot of antibiotics and nasty stuff escape and blend with wild salmon stocks. And there can be huge things like sea lice outbreaks. Pretty much anytime you see this in any sort of large scale mono agriculture system, anytime you have a bunch of animals in really close proximity, it gets pretty nasty. And so that's definitely true of farm salmon. It's also really resource intensive. If you look at the food chain for that, a lot of it's fed by soy crops, which are really a part of some of the bigger deforestation events. So if you look at the whole supply chain that goes into it, it gets complicated, and there's a lot of ugliness. Whereas a wild salmon stock with Bristol, in the case of Bristol Bay, it's just nature at all levels doing what it does best. There's no hatcheries involved.
Yeah.
You got a wild product, a wild population. There's no dams. There's no human intervention
Yep.
other than a harvest, and we can talk about the ways it's sustainable. They're raised on phytoplankton out in the Pacific Ocean. Eating that plankton is what gives salmon their orange hue. And so any orange you're seeing in a farm salmon, it comes from a food dye that's put in their food, not to mention the antibiotics. So I think farm salmon, again, if something like Bristol Bay, which is a perfectly intact wild salmon ecosystem with record, historically high returns that's managed in a symbiosis with the natural environment. If that didn't exist, I would say there's a much bigger place for farm salmon, for things like lab generated meat, which is more a thing. And Bristol Bay can't feed the world its appetite for salmon. I mean that exceeds just the production capacity of the fishery, but it could feed a pretty big chunk and does. And so it's less rich in protein because it's not as, I mean, they'll plug it with fat, and salmon produce fat, and especially if they're swimming around in net pen their whole life, it's super fatty. It's why it's a really sought after texture. You'll taste a farm salmon will kind of taste like a flavorless Jello compared to a good wild product. It doesn't have that chew because it doesn't have muscle fibers that have been actively, traversing thousands of ocean miles throughout their lives. And so it's kind of without much texture from or flavor from a flavor standpoint. But it's a really really good farm king and stuff. Has a buttery texture that wild salmon just can't compete with. But I don't know. I find, even granted that the flavor, and then for me, just the food dye and the antibiotics,
that's enough for me too.
I feed my dog a bunch of like salmon all the time, and a chef gave me a fillet of farm salmon recently just to try, and I brought it home and I gave my dog a little piece, and he was puking in like a couple hours.
Do you know off the top of your head what the percentage versus farmed and wild consumption is in America? I was trying to look the stats up, and I don't really know. I feel like a lot of people, they see salmon and like, oh, it's wild. It's like, it's not, not necessarily. And in fact, a lot of the sushi joints in Denver, I live in the mountains of Colorado, so I mean, we have no ocean near.
It's a product that's more built for mass consumption because it's a really controllable harvest. You can kind of harvest on demand, depending on easier to get fish fresh to you. So people who are obsessed with like getting never frozen salmon, that's an easier market for farm salmon to fill. I don't know percentages. I would like hazard a guess. It's like easily like a 90-10 farm to wild split. Problems you run into with most people who want wild, because I do think most of the world wants wild, is like availability. Wild stocks are available for a short period of time, and don't have a volume that can sustain a chef who wants to put something on their menu and have it there year round. So like people will run it as specials in season. But the other thing is like the cold chain. It really depends on the fishery, like whether you could take a wild product that comes out of the water, hands down, head and shoulders above any farmed in terms of quality, but how good is the processing and the cold chain to take that ingredient and maintain its original quality all the way from the dock to your plate in Denver? And again, like a more controllable supply chain in a farm world, I think, and a more predictable price. Chefs often want like a predictable price, and so they don't want to hang their hat as a sushi restaurant on some wild product that's going to fluctuate week in and week out, might not be available one month. And then, again, in a wild harvest, things are just less predictable. You're dealing with a wild animal, so some quality, and that's kind of where things about Bristol Bay and how we operate and source our fish, I think kind of sets us apart in terms of like a wild salmon fishery, and it's why we get a lot of traction with chefs, because we're able to overcome some of those availability, quality, and price obstacles.
Yeah, that makes sense. Very interesting points there. There's kind of a thread I wanted to pull that you hinted at earlier of like, what is your general harvest method? Maybe explain, the difference between, you guys' method and, how you guys harvest versus traditional like wild salmon, other fisheries that, are in the same space.
Yeah. So there's like three general methods for harvesting salmon. There's like troll caught salmon, which is like a line and a hook, and bait. There's seiner salmon, which is like a big boat, has a huge, really fine mesh net that they like circle around a school of salmon, and they ball it all up and bring it onto their boat, and they can harvest tens of thousands of pounds in one net. And then there is gill net, and that is the whole Bristol Bay fishery. That's our technique. It was a technique that was used by the indigenous folks there back, millennia ago. They used to make gill nets out of gut from seals and stuff, and it's since been replaced with nylon and proliferated as like the main technique. That's also used in rivers where I'm from in Washington. Like a lot of there's a lot of tribal gill net fisheries, and how gill net works is it's kind of like a corrugated fence or diamond chain link fence sort of thing, but it's really thin nylon, and the diamonds are built so that depending on the size fish you're targeting, the head goes in, and then it kind of pinches them around the gills, and so they can't get out. And it's more suited for like a really high volume fishery, which is what Bristol Bay is. Whereas troll caught fish are a little more suited for, there's just like it's a much lower volume enterprise. There's some other really cool techniques out there. There's something called reef netting, which is, around here in Washington, but I won't get into that. So how Bristol Bay, it's like, it's hard to put into words, kind of the scale of like when it's on. It's like a 6-week fishery that on a big year will put up like 40 million fish between like 2,000 folks. So my small crew, me and, 5 people I fish with, often it's just 3 of us on a boat, we can do in a 10-hour span, we can do like 20,000 pounds of fish. And it's an amount that wouldn't be close to possible with like any other or with long line or troll fishing. But what it means is it's a really fast, high volume throughput from like harvest to the fillet line, and from the fillet line to flash freezing. And the way you lock in fresh quality with a frozen fish, with a fish that gets frozen, is how quickly how is it treated out of the water, and how quickly can you get it filleted and flash frozen. And by flash frozen, I mean blasted down to like negative 40 degrees, like Fahrenheit type temperature, not like our sort of chest freezer type temperature. And what that does is it freezes the fats and the oils, which freeze at a much lower temperature, so that the quality is preserved and maintained, and you're not getting a product where when you thaw it, there's a lot of moisture release or compromise on texture. The other thing about such a high volume fishery, a really quick throughput. So the time it takes for us to harvest the fish, get it to the processor, have it filleted and flash frozen, is normally around like 12 to 18 hours or so.
Whoa, that's so cool.
It's a very fast process, and it locks in like a really fresh quality. So I always tell people, like, unless you're getting fish right off the dock, a farmed or a fresh fish, something that's never been frozen, will actually be a lower quality ingredient than something that was flash frozen using cutting edge cold chain on the day of harvest, which is something you often battle with. People who have a preconceived notion that like fresh or never frozen always beats frozen. There's a lot of really shit frozen fish out there that's not treated well, and a lot of it's twice frozen. But truly, if you have a product that was flash frozen right out of the water, blasted down to like -35, and it's been kept at -18 and a real deep freeze from the moment of harvest, you end up with a product that kind of locks in that day one freshness. The other thing that high volume what a high volume gill net fishery like ours is able to do is it's actually the scientists at University of Washington have crunched the numbers, and it's the lowest carbon footprint center plate protein in the world, which is a very unique thing to Bristol Bay, and it's because it's such a high volume fishery. Us with like a really small skiff, we're not running like huge deadliest catch boats. We're running like a 20-foot open boat, and we don't use much gas. There's not much resource input, and we harvest a huge amount of salmon. We harvest fish inshore, so we're right next to the river. It's a really close distance to the processor. We're not like going thousands of miles into the ocean. It's all happening right there, and it's all happening at a super high volume with really low resource input. It all gets shipped down to Seattle on a huge freezer barge. And so it's not getting delivered by plane, which is like all the fresh farm fish you get is like, on a plane from New Zealand or whatever. And so, it's a really high quality product because it's such a fast transfer from the harvest to the flash freeze, and it's a really low carbon footprint product. Up there, vastly better than any like terrestrial protein and better than any seafood carbon footprint, except for like shellfish and other like mollusks and stuff. But in terms of like plate meat protein, it's the lowest carbon footprint in the world.
That's incredible. I didn't even know that. And I guess for people who may be listening, in terms of what is the methods for you guys to, I don't want to say restock, but how do you ensure population control for future harvests? Maybe if you could explain a little bit about that. That's something I'm always interested in, and I just love to hear your perspective on it. Because as a forager myself, like I get asked this question a lot from just like wild foods, but people think of salmon and a lot of this harvesting. That's obviously a question that comes up frequently.
Totally. Yeah. So I always tell people like the most powerful person in our fishery is the biologist, the area biologist, who has a team of people that are up every river. Like salmon populations are segmented by rivers. In my bay, there's the Nushagak River and the Wood River. They each have different across all 5 species: coho, king, sockeye, pink, chum. They're all up both of those rivers, and there's escapement targets for each species up each river. So to pick one example, the Wood River, they target 1.4 million sockeye need to get upriver in order for the population be at a healthy level. And us as the fishermen, we are allowed to fish only when they are sure that they will hit that number. And it's actually organized in a way where there's a risk of over-escapement. So like in a natural population cycle, if a river ever got overcrowded, salmon are digging up each other's eggs. There's too many fish dying in the small streams, and it messes up the pH level. Like that's a thing where there's an optimal level. And some years they actually ask us to go up in the river and try to plug the river, like really full on cap escapement, because they want us to stop over escapement because it's bad for future generations. And so it's been sort of engineered, and that's why I used the word symbiotic earlier, in a way where what the fishermen are doing is harvesting the surplus between the optimal level and the actual return. And because it's kept at like an optimal escapement level, the return always has a surplus in it. And so we're really just again, harvesting the difference between what is the ideal number of fish to return to the river and what's actually coming back. And so that's what I mean by like sustainable in that way. And it's the only wild salmon fishery in the world. It's not the only commercial wild salmon fishery. There's other salmon fisheries that have a commercial purpose, but it's the only wild salmon fishery in the world that has a run that is at historic all-time records. Like, there's never been more sockeye coming back to Bristol Bay than there is right now. And it's being really, it's a huge commercial fishery. And so it's sort of a bright spot and a total model for what it means to have a sort of sustainable relationship with an ecosystem. And there's a lot of reasons I think that Bristol Bay is uniquely positioned to be that example. Like there's no human, big human settlements on the rivers. There's no dam. There's no like diking of rivers that affects the floodplains that fish spawn in that exist throughout, like where I live here in Washington. All of like the Columbia River and a lot of other rivers up and down the West Coast, even in the Northeast, had salmon runs that were as big as what we're talking about in Bristol Bay, but they've all been decimated by like habitat degradation and pollution and other elements. So it's a special place.
Yeah, that sounds incredible. I used to live near the Columbia River in Oregon, and it's just a shame. I mean, there's pictures of like, early on in the 1900s before things got really bad. There was just a huge population of salmon there. And now it's just completely decimated, which is it breaks my heart.
So Mark, like I said, my partner, he's on 2 featured docs, and we're working on a third called The Turn. But The Breach, I think, does a really good job speaking to, they're both great, but The Breach does a nice survey of the history of wild salmon starting in Europe, but on the East Coast and the West Coast, and sort of, another great book is King of Fish, which talks a lot about all these mechanisms. But The Breach does a great job looking at historical wild salmon habitat degradation across previous high runs, and then comparing it to Bristol Bay and what goes on up there. So puts everything.
That's really cool. Put a link to in the show notes about those specific items. That's really helpful. Wow, this has been super informative, man. I will say that I'm learning so much just about like the fisheries and stuff that, even as a forager myself, like I don't really know a whole lot about seafood and seafood cultivation. So this is really helpful. And I guess this is kind of a bigger question, because I don't want to go too far into the weeds here, and how the process works. But what do you see the future, like what are you envisioning the future of this type of seafood harvesting? And do you see any glimmer of hope in how other people are doing their harvesting methods, or like what's the inside scoop?
I think it's a really interesting moment for our fishery, and I guess it's hard to go and talk about it without going into the weeds, but pretty much Bristol Bay sockeye salmon, we've already talked about what makes it so sustainable, but it's truly one of the best, I think, seafood ingredients on the planet. It's the northernmost wild salmon run in the world. So the sockeye is the most flavor-rich salmon out there. But compared to king, it's leaner, doesn't have as much fat. But sockeye up in Bristol Bay, given how far north they are and their winter feeding grounds being more like Arctic waters, they put on a lot more fat. So it's a super unique ingredient. And to put it in relatable terms, it's like it's a product that's a Ferrari that's been sold as like a Mazda or something. And there hasn't been the cold chain technology in place to take that ingredient and maintain its quality from the harvest down to plates in the lower 48. And I meet with chefs every week, and we're still coming back from like a really negative reputation that the fishery built for itself in terms of quality back in like the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. And there's been some trailblazers improving cold chain and really doing the ingredient justice. But I think that's um, that is the near-term future that I'm really excited about, is like taking a product that deserves so much reverence in terms of its story, its sustainability, and its quality, and doing it justice in terms of how we're telling its story. And Mark and I, like I said, we're both filmmakers, and what brought us to starting this company is the intersection of storytelling and food, and we both think food is a story and it should carry a story. And we want to take Bristol Bay salmon out of being seen broadly as like a commodity. Like, forget competing with farm salmon, like it's a different lane, right?
Yeah.
It should not be seen as like, oh, like, can you give me the price? Like, forget it. It's a completely different product. And finally, we're at a point where there's processors up there who, and fishermen, I mean, I've even seen in my 10 years fishing, which is not much time, the difference in how the fleet handles their fish.
Right.
And every year there's quality improvements. And it's a landscape that's been dominated by a lot of like really big corporate processors, a lot of like foreign-owned corporate processors, and there's a lot more fisherman-run energy right now to like creating co-op models and just processor and distribution models that are more run by fishermen, which gives fishermen in the region better livelihoods. But it also, I think, like, we want to be the caretakers and guardians of this resource all the way to the plate, because I think other people who run massive companies and they're bringing in 100 different seafood products, they're not telling the story right, and they're kind of beating it to shit. And so that's where it's really exciting for me to be like a fisherman, but also a distributor, because I'm on both sides of it. And I think that's also where we've found success, is like competing in a landscape where a lot of our competition isn't really telling the story right. And yeah, I mean, I think, look, it's a wild resource, and we know our planet is changing year to year in really scary ways. Bristol Bay has sort of been like an eddy in the river of like overall destruction of our environment, where everything's going to shit. Bristol Bay is a bright spot, and it feels too good to be true, and it feels scary, like it could crash any year. It's an incredibly complicated ecosystem that intersects with everything from like all the variables that affect plankton to ocean acidity to like glacial recession up in its spawning grounds to like there's a million things that it's another way farmed is like, it's more predictable. But yeah, I mean, as long as the fishery can survive, I'm excited about it being a place where people can go to seek out a food that is unbeatable in quality and really rich in story. And as not to plug our own company, but like, yeah, I want to see more companies that are being models in investing money back into regions where food is coming from, to try to protect those resources for future generations. And that's what we're all about. We work with the Bristol Bay Foundation, who they do 4-year scholarships to Indigenous youth from the regions for college and trade schools, and are really active in the effort to get permanent protection from Bristol Bay against efforts like the Pebble Mine Initiative, which is, again, trying to build the largest open pit copper mine in the world at the headwaters of the last great salmon stronghold. So yeah, it's definitely an interesting moment for the fishery. Yeah. And like I said, it's just exciting being at a point where the technology has kind of caught up to the point where we don't need to be putting this fish into cans and kind of selling it as a, shelf stable, not that high quality product. Like we have the cold chain technology now to bring grade A, top-notch, incredible sushi grade fillets around the world. So it's an exciting time for sure.
Yeah, it's incredible what you guys are doing, and I just want to say I appreciate your time today, and I really appreciate what you guys are doing, not only for the salmon fisheries as a whole, but just for the community of food enthusiasts that may be listening to this. It's incredible what you guys are doing, and I think if more farmers and cultivators could have this mindset, I think we'd be in a better off place in the future, and I can only hope that's the case as we kind of evolve, and like you said, the environment is a very precious thing, and it's nice to have one kind of place that is somewhat stable and albeit thriving, which is really cool.
I know. Same goes to you guys. I'm really happy to be a part of your guys' marketplace, and in sort of what I'm saying about shifting the landscape of our connection to food. You guys definitely fit into that, and that's why we're stoked to be partnering. But putting story as part of food, right? And helping people have a connection to where it's coming from and the people and the places where it's coming from, I think is really important in making wild foods more of like a sacrament than just like a lunch or whatever. And I think people want that, and I think it's a really cool niche. So you guys are definitely part of the good fight in that world. So I appreciate all your efforts too.
I appreciate it, man. And I mean, that's the goal, right? The goal is to have a sustainable food system for many years to come. And I think wild food has a pretty negative connotation, unfortunately. I think immediately people think of wild, they think of taking and like not, giving back. I think it's definitely can be done without that negative connotation. I really do.
Right.
I'm a big believer in forest cultivation. I'm a huge believer in, just regular cultivation of seafood and meat in a very sustainable way.
Right.
And I think you guys are a prime example of that. So I can only hope that we continue on this trend for the years to come so that, people can enjoy these incredible ingredients. Because, people like you and I who have, tried wild ingredients and hand harvested them ourselves, we're pretty blessed in that regard. And I think a lot of people haven't really experienced the difference. They don't know the difference. And I think that's super important for us to realize is that, as we, continue on this mission of just changing the food industry as we know it, I think it's important to really explain and help them understand that there is a big difference. It's much better than the crap that you buy at the grocery store that's farmed and, filled with food dye, unfortunately.
Right. Yeah, no, there's definitely a lot of nuance to it on the farm side and the wild side and the farm side. There's the good and the bad. And, the answer isn't strictly on one or the other. The answer is people being informed about the specific fishery or farm or whatever that their food comes from and knowing whether that specific operation is done in a symbiotic way with the environment. It's an education piece, but get there.
Yeah. Matt, I appreciate your time today, man.